They built 14 cabins across my shoreline like the land had never belonged to anyone before them. Every foundation was poured, deep, permanent, deliberate, each one tied to a private launch that cut into the water like a claim staked in concrete. Bronze address plaques were already mounted before the paint dried, polished numbers catching sunlight like ownership had already been decided. The entire project stretched across 3 years and swallowed $4.2 million without hesitation. And the entire time I was holding a document that could erase all of it without raising voice. I didn't object, didn't interrupt, didn't step in front of a single machine. HOA Karen signed off on every stage of that build like she was authorizing something permanent. She read my silence as confusion, like I didn't understand what I had inherited. She assumed I was just another quiet landowner who didn't know how to read what was written into his own property. Before we move forward, drop a comment, "Where are you watching from?" She never asked for clarification, never checked the original records, never once went back far enough to see what had already been decided long before she showed up. She never pulled the 1963 deed that my grandfather had recorded by hand with the county clerk. She never read the shoreline easement written directly into that deed, the one that prohibited exactly what she was building. So I let her continue without interference. I let her sell those cabins as memberships at $78,000 each. I let her secure a construction loan that leaned entirely on land she didn't legally control. I let her stand in front of people and present it like it was already hers. And when everything was finished, when the final 2 buyers were scheduled to close, I walked into that room carrying nothing but paper. I had been reading property documents since I was old enough to understand that land doesn't forget what's written into it. My father made sure of that the day he handed me the folder that would outlive him. Inside it were records that didn't care about timelines or assumptions or authority. I spent years working around water, around boundaries, around the quiet lines that separate ownership from illusion. I knew exactly what a riparian easement meant before HOA Karen ever said the word development. I knew what she had built the moment I saw the first foundation. She didn't know I knew. And that was the only advantage I needed. That shoreline wasn't just land, it was continuity, something that had stayed the same long before she decided to change it. My grandfather bought it when ownership still meant something you carried, not something you leveraged. My father maintained it without turning it into anything else. I grew up on that granite edge where the water meets rock, and memory doesn't need explanation. My daughter learned to swim there without knowing any of this would ever matter. 4 generations stood on that same stretch of shoreline without needing permission from anyone. That was the part HOA Karen never understood. This wasn't about property value or expansion or profit margins. It was about something that had already been decided decades before she started drawing plans. And while she built, I watched. While she invested, I documented. While she expanded, I stayed still, because every structure she added wasn't strengthening her position. It was deepening the consequences waiting underneath it. She rerouted a drainage channel that had been protected longer than she had been alive. She cut down trees that had stood longer than her authority ever would. She poured concrete into spaces that had already been defined in writing as untouchable. Every decision she made added weight to something she didn't know existed. I didn't need to stop her. I needed her to finish, because the moment she crossed the line completely, the line would finally matter. Patience isn't passive when it's built on certainty. Silence isn't weakness when it's holding something irreversible. My grandfather understood that before I was born. My father carried it without needing to explain it, and I sat there while a multi-million-dollar project grew on top of something that had already decided its outcome. By the time she was done, there wasn't anything left for me to argue. There was only something left for me to show. My grandfather didn't arrive at that shoreline with ambition. He arrived with intention that had already been tested by time and sacrifice. He walked into the county recorder's office carrying years of labor in a form that didn't need explanation. A cashier's check earned through repetition, discipline, and refusal to spend on anything that didn't last. He didn't negotiate like a developer. He finalized like a man who had already decided this land would outlive him. The sketch he carried wasn't professional, but it didn't need to be, because he understood the land before he owned it. The cove wasn't just water, it was structure, a natural formation that protected itself from the outside. The ridge behind it cut the wind before it reached the shoreline. The water stayed cold even when everything else turned warm, stagnant. That granite shelf wasn't an accident, it was a foundation that didn't need to be built. He recognized all of that before anyone else thought it mattered. He started building the dock before ownership was finalized, because he wasn't waiting for permission to commit. But the dock wasn't the most important thing he created there. The most important thing he did was something no one could see from the water, or from the road, or from any future development plan. Before he left that recorder's office, he secured something permanent permanent in writing. He didn't just buy land, he defined how it could never be changed. The easement he filed wasn't decorative language. It was restriction built to outlast anyone who tried to ignore it. He had already seen what happened when people treated water like it could be redirected without consequence. He had already dealt with someone who thought altering a natural flow wouldn't matter. He fought that once, and he decided he wouldn't fight it again. So he turned that experience into something enforceable. 2 pages, written with clarity, attached to the land itself so it couldn't be separated later. That document didn't rely on memory or respect or community agreement. It relied on permanence. It became part of the land the same way the shoreline itself existed. My father inherited that without needing to use it. The HOA at the time didn't challenge anything because it didn't try to change anything. It existed quietly, like an afterthought, something that maintained access but never redefined ownership. There was no pressure, no expansion, no reason to question what had already been settled. My father treated the land the same way his father, as something to maintain, not something to maximize. That stability lasted long enough for people to forget that anything beneath it existed. That's the part that always changes first. People stop looking backward. They stop checking what came before them. They assume that if nothing has been enforced, nothing exists. And that's exactly where HOA Karen stepped in. She didn't introduce conflict immediately. She introduced structure, committees, meetings, plans that sounded reasonable enough to pass without resistance. She understood that control doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from gradual acceptance. The development committee wasn't questioned because it didn't look like a threat. It looked like organization. It looked like improvement. And buried inside that process were the first signs of what she intended to do. She didn't need approval from people who didn't know what to look for. She needed time. When my father passed, the land didn't change, but the environment around it had already started to. The folder he left behind wasn't symbolic. It was functional. Every document inside it had a purpose that hadn't been activated. The deed, the surveys, the handwritten note, they weren't reminders. They were instructions waiting for the moment they would matter again. When I had it reviewed, there was no uncertainty left. The easement wasn't outdated. It wasn't weakened. It wasn't open to interpretation. It was intact, enforceable, and directly applied to the exact area HOA Karen had already decided to use. That was the moment everything aligned, not emotionally, not reactively, but structurally. Because once you understand that something is already protected at that level, you don't rush to defend it. You wait until someone else builds their entire position on top of ignoring it. The first time HOA Karen presented the development, she did it like the outcome was already decided, and the only thing left was for everyone else to catch up. The renderings were polished, the language was controlled, and the room responded exactly how she expected it to. People don't question something that looks complete. They assume the details have already been handled. That's how she moved forward without resistance. Every permit that followed carried that same assumption. No one checked deeper because nothing at the surface suggested they needed to. The system didn't fail loudly. It failed quietly by not looking far enough back. Construction moved the same way, efficient, controlled, uninterrupted. One cabin became 3, then 6, then more, and each one reinforced the illusion that everything was valid. The ribbon cutting wasn't a milestone. It was confirmation that no one was going to stop her. And then she crossed the point where mistakes become violations. The drainage channel wasn't something that could be moved without consequence, but she treated it like an obstacle instead of a boundary. The trees weren't just removed, they were erased in a way that assumed no one would challenge it. The concrete launch didn't just change access, it altered something that had already been defined as protected. Every one of those actions stacked on top of each other, not as isolated decisions, but as a pattern of ignoring what was already there. I watched all of it without stepping in, not because I didn't see it, but because I needed it to continue. Because the more complete her project became, the more complete the consequences would be when it stopped. Financially, she committed fully, and that was the part that mattered most. Membership sold, loans secured, projections built, everything tied to the assumption that the land was hers to use. The bank didn't question it because the paperwork they saw didn't show a problem. That's the danger of incomplete information. It creates confidence where caution should exist. HOA Karen interpreted my silence the same way. She needed opposition to slow down. Without it, she accelerated. Letters started arriving, structured to establish pressure, not legality. Claims were made that didn't hold up under scrutiny, but they weren't designed to hold up. They were designed to intimidate. The fines followed the same pattern, each one attempting to shift control through repetition rather than validity. She escalated because she believed escalation would force a response. What she didn't understand was that every step she took created more documentation. Every claim, every notice, every fabricated violation added to a record that would eventually matter more than anything she was building. Social pressure came next, because when legal pressure doesn't work, perception becomes the next tool. Anonymous posts, controlled language, carefully framed accusations, all designed to isolate without direct confrontation. And for a moment, it worked, not in a way that changed anything legally, but in a way that tested what this would cost beyond paper. That's where most people break, not under legal pressure, but under social isolation. That's where reactions happen. That's where mistakes are made. I didn't react, because none of it changed what was already written into the land, and none of it changed what was going to happen the moment everything she built had to stand against it. The moment I found them inside my property line, the story stopped being theoretical and became documented reality. They weren't standing near a boundary or guessing at lines. They were deep enough inside the tree line to remove any ambiguity about intent. One of them had already planted a tripod into the ground like the space belonged to him. The other was standing at the exact edge of the drainage corridor that had been protected for decades. Taking photographs like evidence could be created without consequence. I didn't rush toward them, because urgency gives people the illusion they still control the situation, and I had no interest in giving that. I walked slowly, deliberately, letting them see me before I spoke, letting them understand that they were not unobserved and not unchallenged. When I asked who authorized the survey, the answer came too easily, too casually, like they expected that name alone to settle the question. Crestwood HOA retained us, he said, as if authority could be borrowed without verification. I didn't respond to the name. I asked for credentials, because names don't validate actions. Documentation does. When they couldn't produce a license number, when they couldn't identify a firm, when they couldn't tie themselves to anything enforceable, the entire performance collapsed into what it actually was. Unauthorized entry dressed up as procedure. I didn't raise my voice because control doesn't need volume, it needs clarity, and I gave them one instruction without room for interpretation. Leave my property now. They complied faster than they arrived, because people who rely on assumption rarely prepare for direct verification. But before they left, I recorded everything, not emotionally, not reactively, but precisely. Faces, equipment, vehicle, plate number, time, position, all of it documented in a way that could not be reframed later. That's the difference between witnessing something and building something. One disappears, the other stays. When I walked into the sheriff's office that afternoon, I wasn't reporting a disagreement. I was placing a fact into a system that recognizes documentation over narrative. The deputy read their authorization letter twice, and the second time was slower, because he already knew what the first reading confirmed. The bylaw they cited didn't give them the authority they claimed. It never had, and the gap between what they said they could do and what they were actually allowed to do was now part of an official record. That record mattered more than anything HOA Karen had sent up to that point, because it existed outside her control. That was the moment everything shifted. Not publicly, not visibly, but structurally. I stopped observing and started assembling. Every letter she had sent, every fine she had fabricated, every notice that tried to establish pressure without foundation, all of it moved from isolated events into a single continuous record. The screenshots my daughter had taken stopped being emotional reactions and became pattern evidence. The permits I had been tracking weren't just procedural steps anymore. They were proof of omission. Every date connected, every name aligned, every dollar attached itself to something that could be traced. The file wasn't just growing, it was tightening, becoming something that didn't need explanation because it explained itself. When her attorney sent the demand letter for $22,000, it wasn't intimidating, it was predictable, because escalation is the only move left when earlier pressure fails. 4 pages of formal language designed to sound final, designed to make compliance feel easier than resistance. I read it once, then again, not because I doubted anything, but because I wanted to see exactly how far she was willing to push something that had no foundation underneath. When my attorney responded with 2 sentences, it wasn't dismissive, it was precise, because anything more would have suggested uncertainty. But precision doesn't silence doubt completely, not at night, not when everything is quiet enough for questions to surface without interruption. At 2 in the morning, certainty doesn't disappear, but it gets tested, not by facts, but by possibility. What if something had been missed? What if there was a flaw buried somewhere deep enough to survive unnoticed? What if 60 years of assumed protection had a weakness no one had ever needed to find before? That's how doubt works. It doesn't argue, it suggests. And the only way to answer suggestion is verification. I didn't wait. I didn't sit with it. I went back to the source. The county clerk's office doesn't care about anxiety. It deals in record. And when I pulled the original microfilm and saw that document under direct light, every line exactly where it had always been, every word intact, every mark deliberate. The question ended the same way it started, without drama, without interpretation, just fact. The note in the margin wasn't decorative, it was intention recorded in the same place as the law itself. And there is a difference between believing something is solid and seeing that it cannot be anything else. That was the last time doubt had a place in any partis. From that moment forward, every move was timed, not considered. When the press release came out announcing the final closings, it didn't create urgency, it confirmed alignment. She had set the moment herself without realizing what she was setting it against. The document my attorney and I had prepared wasn't new, it was waiting, built to match exactly what had been done and where it had been done. Every permit number listed, every clause referenced, every violation connected to something that couldn't be dismissed as interpretation. But we didn't send it yet, because timing isn't about acting early, it's about acting when action carries weight that cannot be ignored. The environmental report I submitted wasn't aggressive, it was accurate, and accuracy carries farther than accusation when it's placed in the right system. Coordinates don't argue, maps don't exaggerate, permit gaps don't explain themselves away. The inquiry opened quietly, exactly the way everything else had been building quietly, because loud reactions attract resistance, but quiet records accumulate consequence. The call to the title company was the simplest move in the entire sequence, because it didn't require anything but confirmation. Dates, parties, readiness, everything aligned exactly where it needed to be. I didn't warn anyone, didn't hint, didn't suggest, because there is no advantage in alerting someone to something they've already built themselves into. On the morning of March 14th, nothing felt urgent, because urgency implies uncertainty, and there wasn't any left. I moved through the routine deliberately, not as preparation, but as continuation, because this wasn't a confrontation, it was a conclusion already reached, waiting to be presented. The certified copies weren't about proof, they were about timing, about making sure that when the document was placed on that table, it carried the exact moment with it. When I arrived and saw the buyers, I didn't see participants, I saw consequences that hadn't realized themselves yet. They were walking into something complete without knowing it wasn't valid. HOA Karen was already inside, already composed, already settled into the belief that the day would move exactly as she expected it to. That's what happens when confidence is built on assumption. It feels stable right until it meets something that doesn't move. When I handed the document to the title officer, I didn't explain it, because explanation invites interpretation, and interpretation wasn't necessary. She read it the way someone reads something that immediately matters. Not emotional, not dramatic, but with recognition. When she left the room, she didn't rush, but she didn't delay either, and that space in between is where realization begins. The 10 minutes that followed didn't feel long, because time behaves differently when the outcome is already decided. When HOA Karen stepped into the hallway, the smile she carried wasn't confidence anymore. It was habit, something she had used enough times to expect it would work again. She asked if I was there to cause trouble, but the question didn't carry weight, because trouble implies disruption, and I wasn't disrupting anything, I was revealing it. I didn't answer her directly, because the answer wasn't something I needed to say, it was something she was about to see. When everyone sat down and the document was placed in front of them, the room didn't change immediately, because realization takes a second longer than expectation. But when the title officer spoke, when she explained that the easement existed, that it had been recorded, that it affected everything in that room, the shift happened all at once. The attorney's question confirmed ignorance, not opposition. HOA Karen's response confirmed denial, not defense. The buyer's silence confirmed understanding, because silence is what happens when something expected no longer exists. And in that moment, nothing needed to be argued, nothing needed to be proven beyond what was already in front of them. The closing didn't stop because I objected. It stopped because it couldn't continue. The moment those closings failed, the structure HOA Karen had been standing on stopped behaving like something stable and started behaving like something exposed, because once a transaction collapses in a controlled environment like a title office, it doesn't stay contained. It moves outward into every system that touches it. Within 48 hours, the notice of easement violation was no longer something sitting in a folder waiting for the right moment. It was served formally, simultaneously, and without warning to every party that had built their position on ignoring. The HOA received it as an organization. HOA Karen received it personally in the role she had used to authorize everything, and the bank received it as the entity that had financed the entire structure without ever verifying what it was built on. There was no delay between those deliveries, no staggered communication, no opportunity for anyone to adjust their position before understanding the full weight of what had already happened. The bank's response came first, and it came fast, faster than institutions usually, because institutions don't rush unless they recognize something that threatens the foundation of their own involvement. 72 hours was all it took for them to shift the loan into technical default. And that shift wasn't symbolic, it was structural, because once collateral becomes legally compromised, the agreement built on it no longer behaves like a secured position, it behaves like a liability. The cabins were still there, the shoreline hadn't physically changed, but the legal status of everything tied to that land had been altered in a way that removed stability from the entire financial structure. That's what HOA Karen never calculate, that legal reality doesn't need physical movement to collapse something. It just needs to be recognized in the right place at the right time. At the same time, the financial pressure began tight. The environmental side moved forward independently, because once that report was submitted, it didn't rely on my timing anymore. It followed its own process. The findings came back without hesitation, and they didn't leave room for interpretation. The drainage corridor had been altered in violation of wetland protection statutes, not as a minor adjustment, but as a direct interference with a protected natural flow. The concrete launch had been installed without the required permits, which meant it bypassed the exact review process designed to prevent that kind of alteration. The trees that had been removed weren't just vegetation. They were part of a designated habitat corridor, and each one carried its own measurable value that extended beyond timber into environmental function. When those violations stacked together, they didn't create a list, they created a pattern, and patterns are what courts and agencies respond to more aggressively than isolated incidents. The HOA was no longer dealing with a disagreement over land use, it was facing a layered situation where property law, environmental regulation, and financial exposure were all pointing at the same set of actions. That's the moment where control disappears, because no single response can address all of those pressures at once. Filing the case wasn't escalation, it was alignment, because by the time it reached the court, everything had already been documented, structured, and connected. The request for a preliminary injunction wasn't dramatic, it was precise, because it didn't attempt to resolve everything at once. It simply asked the court to recognize that continued operation would deepen an already established violation. The hearing itself didn't need to be long, because clarity shortens arguments. HOA Karen's attorney attempted to reframe the easement as ambiguous, to suggest that time had softened its impact, that usage had somehow redefined its meaning. But those arguments rely on flexibility, and a recorded easement doesn't provide it. When the judge asked whether it had been recorded, the question wasn't exploratory, it was confirmatory, because the answer determined everything that followed. Once that answer was given, the rest of the argument lost relevance. The injunction was granted, and with it, the entire develop stopped functioning as a business. 14 cabins that had been positioned as income-generating assets became structures that could not legally be used for their intended purpose. The projected revenue disappeared in a single ruling, not gradually, not partially, but completely, because when the legal right to operate is removed, projections don't adjust, they vanish. The membership holders who had entered that process expecting completion were now holding something that could not deliver what they had been promised, and that shift changed the direction of pressure immediate. Up until that point, HOA Karen had been managing perception, controlling information, shaping how the situation was understood within the community. But once a court order enters the equation, perception doesn't hold, because it gets replaced by something enforceable. The people who had invested began asking questions that could not be answered with reassurance. They didn't need speculation, they needed explanation, and explanation requires truth when documentation already exists. A group of them moved quickly, pooling resources, hiring their own representation, not to challenge the easement, because by then that part was no longer uncertain, but to understand what had been known before any of this started. That shift is critical, because it redirects the focus from outcome to intent, from what happened to what was known when decisions were made. Discovery doesn't rely on statements, it relies on records, and records don't adjust themselves to protect anyone involved. The survey reviewed in 2019 wasn't hidden, it contained a direct reference to the easement, clear enough that it couldn't be missed by anyone reading it with basic attention. That meant awareness existed before construction, before permits, before any financial commitments were made. And then there was the email, the one that didn't attempt to explain or justify, the one that simply instructed omission. Don't flag the easement, it's old, no one will chase it. That sentence did more than confirm confirm awareness. It confirmed decision because it showed that the risk had been identified and then intentionally ignored. When that entered the courtroom, it didn't need interpretation because intent was already present in the wording itself. That's when the collapse stopped being gradual and became immediate. HOA Karen didn't argue publicly after that, didn't attempt to reframe anything, didn't issue a defense that could hold under that level of clarity. She resigned within days, not as a strategic move, but as an unavoidable one, because once intent is documented, position becomes irrelevant. Her absence from the community happened as quietly as her control had once been established. No announcement, no explanation, just removal. The structure she had built didn't collapse in one moment. It unraveled in layers: financial, legal, environmental, and personal, each one reinforcing the others until there was nothing left that could support what she had started. And through all of it, nothing I had done required escalation beyond what had already been written to the land itself. Because the confrontation wasn't built on force, it was built on something that didn't need to move in order to end everything she had built, on top of ignoring. Once the court issued its ruling, the situation stopped being something that could be negotiated informally and became something that had to be executed precisely. Because court orders don't suggest outcomes, they define them, and everything that followed moved under that definition without exception or delay. The validation of the easement was not just confirmation of what had already been known, it was a formal declaration that removed any remaining space for argument. Because once a court affirms a recorded easement as fully enforceable, every structure built in violation of it loses the ability to exist as intended. The 14 cabins were no longer assets. They were liabilities tied to a location they could not legally operate within, and that distinction reshaped every conversation that followed, from financial negotiations to environmental compliance. The order to restore the drainage corridor was not optional, not flexible, not something that could be delayed without consequence. It came with a defined timeline and direct oversight, meaning the very ground that had been altered now had to be returned to its original state under supervision that would document every step of that reversal. The removal of the concrete launch carried the same weight, because it wasn't just about undoing a structure, it was about acknowledging that it should never have been placed there in the first place, and that acknowledgement carries legal consequences beyond the act itself. The damages awarded were calculated with a level of precision that reflects how the system measures impact, not based on convenience or replacement cost, but on actual loss, including environmental value, functional disruption, and the cost of enforcing what had been ignored. The 11 trees that had been cut were not valued as timber, they were valued as part of a protected system, meaning their removal was treated as a loss that extended beyond physical presence into ecological function, and that kind of valuation changes how consequences are applied. At the same time, the investigation into HOA Karen's actions moved into a separate channel that didn't depend on the civil outcome, because misrepresentation in permit applications is not a private dispute. It is a matter that involves the integrity of the process itself. When documentation shows that material information was intentionally withheld, the issue stops being about development and becomes about compliance with regulatory systems designed to prevent exactly that kind of omission. The bank, already positioned in a weakened state due to the loan default, shifted into recovery mode, and recovery in that context doesn't focus on fairness, it focuses on minimizing loss, which meant pursuing any available assets connected to the agreement, including funds that had nothing to do with the original decision, but were still tied to the structure that enabled it. That's where the impact spread beyond the individuals directly involved and reached into the broader HOA, because collective systems carry collective exposure, even when responsibility is not equally distributed. The transition to new leadership wasn't presented as resolution, it was presented as necessity, because once a structure fails at that level, it has to be rebuilt under different control, or it continues to carry the same risk forward. The apology letter that followed didn't attempt to repair anything beyond acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is often the only thing left when the outcome has already been determined. The membership holders who had invested in the project found themselves in different positions, depending on timing and negotiation. Some unable to exit, others still working through the consequences, because resolution in situations like this rarely happens uniformly. It unfolds based on individual circumstances tied to a shared mistake. The legal actions taken against HOA Karen personally moved on a separate timeline, one that did not rely on community response or internal restructuring, because once intent is documented in a way that meets the threshold for investigation, it follows a process that exists independently of everything else. The restoration work began under supervision, not as a symbolic act, but as a requirement, and watching that process unfold carried a different weight than watching the construction had, because this time every movement was aligned with something that had already been established as correct. The same ground that had been altered was being returned, not perfectly, not identically, but intentional, and intention is what defines whether a space is being used or restored. The new trees planted along the corridor were not replacements in the sense of equivalence, because time cannot be recreated, but they represented continuation, and continuation is the closest thing restoration achieves. Standing there and watching that work take place didn't feel like reversal. It felt like alignment, like something that had been pushed out of place was being brought back into a position it was always meant to hold, and through all of it, nothing required me to push further, because the system had already taken over the process of enforcing what had been ignored, and once that process begins, it doesn't stop based on preference or pressure. It continues until everything that was out of place has been addressed in the only way it can be, through correction that matches the scale of what was done. When everything was finished, when the last piece of concrete was removed, and the final section of the drainage corridor had been restored to a form that allowed the water to move the way it always had. The shoreline didn't look new, it looked right, and there is a difference between those two things that doesn't need explanation once you see it. The granite shelf was exposed again, not as something reclaimed, but as something that had simply been uncovered, because it had never actually gone anywhere. It had only been obstructed. Standing there didn't feel like standing on a victory. It felt like standing on something that had remained unchanged beneath everything that had happened above it. The water moved the same way it had before any of this started. Not faster, not slower, not altered, just consistent. Because consistency is what defines something that hasn't been broken at its core. The dock remained, weathered but intact, carrying the same marks it had always carried, because it had never needed to be anything else. The new trees along the bank didn't replace what had been lost, but they established something forward, something that would exist long after the events that required them were no longer relevant. The folder that my father had handed me sat on the table again, open the same way it had been the first time I understood what it contained, and the documents inside it had expanded, not in meaning, but in confirmation, because everything that had been added to it proved that what had already been there was enough. The court ruling, the restoration order, the records of what had been done and what had been correct, all of it fit into the same space as the original deed, not as additions, but as continuations of the same decision made decades earlier. When I handed that folder to my daughter, I didn't explain it as something complicated, because complexity isn't what protects something like that. Understanding is, and understanding doesn't require volume, it requires clarity. She held it the same way I had, not because she knew everything inside it, but because she understood that it mattered, and sometimes that is enough to carry something forward without needing to define every detail immediately. The shoreline didn't belong to me in the way people usually define ownership. It existed within a structure that had been set long before I was responsible for it, and that responsibility didn't come with authority to change it. It came with the expectation to maintain it. HOA Karen never understood that distinction, because she approached the land as something that could be shaped to fit a plan, something that could be adjusted until it matched what she wanted it to be. But the land had already decided what it was allowed to become, and that decision didn't shift because someone ignored it long enough to believe it didn't exist. When everything settled, there wasn't anything left to argue, nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend, because the only thing that had ever needed to be shown had already been placed on a table and recognized for exactly what it was. The absence of noise at the end wasn't empty, it was complete, because completion doesn't need confirmation. It just exists in the same way it always has, without needing acknowledgement from anyone who tried to change it. HOA Karen was no longer part of that space, not because she had been removed forcefully, but because what she built could not remain where it had been placed, and once that happened, there was nothing left for her to stand on. The water didn't respond to any of it. It didn't change direction, didn't adjust to what had happened. It continued the same way it always had, because it was never part of the conflict. It was part of what had been protected from it, and standing there at the edge of that shoreline, with nothing nothing left to interrupt it. There was only one thing that remained true from the beginning to the end. The paper never moved, and it never needed to.